Senior Minister of State for Trade and Industry and Education, the Government of Singapore, His Excellency Mr. Chee Hong Tat, my friend and collaborator for many years, High Commissioner Javed Ashraf, distinguished members of the Government of Singapore, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be in Singapore for the region's first Business and Innovation Summit on India at the commencement of the second term of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government. I congratulate the High Commission of India on organizing this summit. I thank the Ministry of Trade and Industry and Enterprise, Singapore, for their support. The scale and the breadth of the summit speaks to the strength and the potential of our relationship. There is no better place than Singapore to organize a summit of this kind. Singapore is not just a leading economic partner of India, it is also the region's hub for trade, investment, aviation, and finance. This is a nation where the region's diversity converges and ideas meet. Today, on the strength of innovation and foresight, it is giving shape to the future that we are all stepping into. Singapore's success has shown that size is no barrier to the scale of a nation's achievement and to the strength of its voice in the world. My own personal association and visits to Singapore commenced before I entered the teens. Through a long diplomatic career spanning over 4 decades, and as Ambassador of India to the United Nations, both in Geneva and in New York, I have seen Singapore stand consistently for a rule-based order and multilateralism. Those principles have never been more important than today, at a time of multiple transitions and shifts in the world, especially here in this region, the epicenter of emerging geopolitics, a region that will profoundly shape the course of this century. For India, Singapore has been, over the past 3 decades, the political, economic, and intellectual bridge to Southeast Asia, and it remains an important gateway to the world for a globalizing India. Singapore is the leading source of foreign direct investments into India, accounting nearly for 16% of cumulative FDI flowing into India since the year 2000. Singapore is also a major source for foreign portfolio investments and external commercial borrowings. Over 80% of our external commercial bonds and a majority of rupee-denominated bonds are listed on Singapore's exchange. In every area of our development priority, urban solutions, smart cities, infrastructure, skill development, aviation, to name a few, Singapore is an important and major partner. India, too, makes a significant contribution to this economic hub. Singapore is the top destination for Indian investments abroad. Around 20% of Indian investments abroad have come to Singapore. Nearly 9,000 Indian companies are registered here. India is already the 3rd largest source of tourists in Singapore, and tourist arrival from India is growing at 10 to 15% a year. I believe they spend well. Growing connectivity is reinforcing proximity. Singapore is amongst the best connected international destinations to India. 18 Indian cities are connected to Singapore through over 500 weekly flights in both directions. And our agreement with Singapore and ASEAN provide for several more cities to be linked. So the number of flights that I mentioned, 500, and I see the CEO of Singapore Airlines here, this is a figure which is rising both in terms of the number of cities and in the number of flights. In India's competitive and cooperative federalism, states play a key role in economic development. We now have a growing number of Indian states offering new opportunities to Singapore. In this summit, we have 4 participating states, traditional partners like Andhra Pradesh, and new ones like Odisha. I'm sure the presence of their representatives here is intended both to produce and create that creativity and also to tap the economic potential that is available here. Now our partnership is taking a leap into the digital age. In the course of the last 2 years, we have launched pioneering new initiatives in fintech and innovation. Singapore is the first country where Prime Minister Modi launched India's RuPay card here in this hall in June 2018. Later this year, we are on course to make this the first country to launch the Bhim QR. We were honored that Prime Minister Modi became the first head of government to deliver the keynote address at the Singapore FinTech Festival in November 2018 to speak about India's revolutionary and inspiring story of financial inclusion and the digitalization of the economy, governance and delivery of public services. Together, we are working on building an international digit platform to connect micro, small and medium enterprises and develop an architecture to share our experience in digital governance and financial inclusions with the rest of the world. Here in this venue, at the startup exhibition on the Inspreneur platform launched by the High Commission last year, we see a large number of Indian startups and many from Singapore demonstrating the exciting possibilities to transform our economies and our lives. Forging new partnerships in areas like fintech, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, health and biotech, agrotech, they are the seeds of our partnership in the digital age. People are the greatest source of strength for any enterprise and partnership. India and Singapore are blessed by the comfort of shared heritage and familiarity of connected histories. Today, Singapore hosts among the most talented, accomplished, and connected community of Indian professionals, entrepreneurs, and innovators outside India. They are a part of Singapore's story, and they are a solid bridge to the future of our partnership. Now, as we embark on the next phase of this government, we look to the future with higher ambitions for India and new opportunities for India and the world to work together. Singapore will be among our foremost partners. Prime Minister Modi returned to power this summer with a larger vote and a stronger mandate in the biggest democratic election conducted in human history. This was a vote of acknowledgement for the achievement of the previous 5 years, and it was a vote of confidence in the path to the future. The economic achievements were impressive. Growth averaged 7.5% a year over 5 years, the fastest among major economies, and it was achieved on the strength of improving macroeconomic conditions. Inflation rate came down, fiscal deficit reduced, current account deficit also shrank. Each remains in a comfortable zone. The defining achievement of the last 5 years were the transformation in access, empowerment, and inclusion for every citizen of India. Over the course of these 5 years, we have increased the sanitation coverage from under 40% to over 90% of the population, building nearly 100 million toilets and launching a mass movement around a basic necessity. We have added 13 million affordable rural homes and are well on the way to add 10 million affordable urban homes by 2020. Providing cooking gas to 80 million women, extended electricity to each of our 600,000 villages, connected 97% of our rural habitats as we added 195,000 kilometers of rural roads and extended 200 million microcredit for the weakest section of society, over 70% of which went to women. And above all, we have added 350 million bank accounts, bringing banking within the reach of all. Today, India is a nation of more than 1 billion bank accounts, 1 billion mobile connections, and more than 1 billion digital identity. It is the most extensive public infrastructure in the world. And together with the world's most sophisticated digital payment system that also includes provision for those without phone and internet, it has transformed governance and delivery of public services. It has brought pension, insurance, and welfare benefits within the reach of all, empowered the weak and mainstreamed the marginalized, unleashed innovation, and it has brought in a revolution of hope and opportunities. These are not just political, social, and moral imperatives, but also create opportunities, improve productivity, and spur economic growth. There was, of course, multiple transformations across the economy. There is unprecedented expansion in infrastructure, from highways to aviation, ports to inland waterways, digital networks to renewable energy. The tax regime has changed. Lower tax rates, increasing stability, faster resolution of tax disputes, and electronic filing systems. GST is the biggest tax reform since independence. It has replaced 17 taxes and 23 cesses by one single tax. Our personal income tax base has expanded by nearly 20 million. It reflects much higher levels of compliance and collection. Perhaps one of the most significant and far-reaching reform is the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. In a remarkably short time, we have set up an excellent ecosystem for resolution of stressed assets. Nearly 4,000 cases have come into the resolution process. Around 1,000 have been resolved in an average time of 300 days. The non-performing assets of banks have come down from over 13% to under 10% in a year. The Indian startup sector is flourishing and is now the third largest in the world. It is driven by the talent and enterprise of youth and many supportive schemes of the government. For us, the startups do not mean just those who work in the frontier areas of artificial intelligence and data in metro cities, but also in our small towns and villages, being brought into a national grid by a broadband network that will connect each of our 250,000 village councils. Over 300,000 kilometers of optic fiber network has already been connected more than half of these councils. Urbanization is an area with which I have some familiarity, having been minister for the last 2 years, and one on which I have participated in the evolution of the ongoing flagship programs. Urban India is now receiving attention that it never had. 100 smart cities, new cities and towns, mass transit, waste management, pollution control, sustainable habitat, and affordable housing are programs of great priority for us. There is a fundamental transformation taking place in scale, quality, technology, and approach to building a new urban future for India. When I was permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, I used to say then and even earlier that there are two narratives about India with which most Indian diplomats have had to deal. One is that India is a highly successful post-colonial reconstruction story, that today we are the world's largest democracy and that we use the processes of democracy to deliver goods and services to our last population. That narrative with which Javed and I have been associated and which he and I and Jai Shankar and others have contributed to also has another dimension, which is that in spite of being a remarkable success story, we also contain within our large population, developmental challenges which perhaps sometimes people tend to forget. And let me point to just one of those challenges, that we have more poor people than all the world's poor in the least developed countries of the world put together. I am only making this comment because in the interactive session, which my colleague, Mr. Jaishankar, had last evening, there was a suggestion that perhaps India is turning back to the old days of Garibi Hatao. And I completely endorse my colleague's answer. Nothing could be farther from the truth. The Garibi Hatao slogans of the past were just that. They were slogans. When people in several generations talked about removing poverty, but perhaps didn't get very far. What we are witnessing today is a paradigmatic shift, a basic transformation which is taking place in India. And let me just point in the direction which is already available in the public domain, but let me point to a few facts. India today, ladies and gentlemen, is watching a process which can be summed up in the following terms. The Millennium Development Goals, which the United Nations set for itself, succeeded largely because a large country, developing country, China, was able to ensure that hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty. With a little help from countries like India, Nigeria, and other developing countries. But the Sustainable Development Goals will succeed because India will succeed. In fact, I have the privilege as the Minister for Housing and Urban Affairs of dealing at least with 6, and you could possibly argue, with 11 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Inclusive cities, gender empowerment, removing poverty. And what we are witnessing in India is truly remarkable, involving a paradigmatic shift. Let me just, since this is essentially a business summit or a business meeting, let me point in a few directions. Today, we are engaged in a process of fundamental urbanization. When we became an independent country in 1947, 17% of India lived in urban spaces, but that was 17% of a population base of only 350 million. Today, the latest census we have is the census of 2011. According to that, 30% plus of India lives in urban spaces. But we are working towards 2030, when the Sustainable Development Goals will be completed. In India's case, they'll be completed much earlier. We will have, ladies and gentlemen, 600 million people living in urban spaces then. One of the statistics that I like to throw around, especially with mature and thinking audiences like this, is that 70% of India's urban space of 2030 has still to be built. Therein lies the economic opportunity. Today, we are building something like 700 to 900 million square meters of urban space every year. This is a process which is going on. Do you know what that means? That means we are building one Chicago every year. When we talk of metro, when we talk of urban transportation, it is easy to forget that the first metro transport system took effect in 2002 when Mr. Vajpayee was the Prime Minister. Today we have 687 kilometers of world-class, secure, stable, efficient metro systems running in our cities. We have another 600 kilometers under construction. This is a process, this is just started. And for a country like Singapore, which has stood by us and partnered in our development, I think the future, both in terms of technology, innovation, is something that we need to look at in terms of the opportunities which India is going to be offering. This sentiment of New India that Prime Minister talks about, a blend of individual aspirations and collective endeavors, are currently encompassed in the objective of becoming a $5 trillion economy in the next 5 years. We are today a $2.89 trillion economy. The senior minister, while speaking and enlightening us, talked about the benefits of a rule-based multilateral trading system and the need to adopt outward-oriented postures. I would just like to remind ourselves that out of India's $2.8 trillion economy, which is going to be a $5 trillion economy by 2024, 50% of that GDP is accounted for by the external sector. So let us make absolutely no mistakes. India always has been for trade, and it has been for embracing the values of free trade. But you will also agree that many of us perhaps were not entirely in a position to anticipate the changes which took place in the global system. And some of us, therefore, need to negotiate even harder to make sure that the challenges to, especially in the manufacturing sector, are preserved. Our people and each sector in the economy have a clear mission and purpose outlined by the Prime Minister, and all the determinants of growth, demography, politics, national cohesion, governance, scale of investment, breadth of enterprise and innovation are all aligned to sustain the high rates of growth for a long time. Very often, if you were to live in New Delhi, as I do, and you look at the kind of comments that our press produces of economic slowdown, of course, I want to be careful. I said if you had a 5.5% rate of growth in other parts of the world, you would be jumping with joy. But I don't think that is the kind of message that an economy which is used to growing at 7.5% or 7% plus wants to hear. But equally, I think I've just come back from Europe. I was there last evening, till I arrived here last evening. And there is a global slowdown, there is an adjustment, but I always, because I'm an optimist, like to remind myself we had 11 years of sustained expansion. And after 11 years, if you have a little bit of a blip and you have to deal with a slowing down process, we will take it in our stride and we will devise policies designed to meet that. But I am very optimistic about our future. And as we set ourselves these targets, India's commitment to openness and global integration, as I said, remains strong. We are among the most open economies for foreign investment. We will continue to not just keep our economy open for investment, we'll also make it easier to enter and to do business. We will continue to enable and ease foreign trade and make our ports and customs more efficient. And as we grow, our links with the region will also expand. For 2 millennia, the tides of ocean have forged a natural link between India and Southeast Asia. We are now reclaiming the heritage of those links. Singapore has the strength and expertise to benefit from the rapidly growing opportunities in many areas of India's development, priorities in our financial markets, and innovation and digital economy. We must find ways to connect small and medium enterprises in areas of Singapore's strength, electronics, food processing, health, biomedical services, and many others. We should explore synergies for cooperating in third countries. Singapore companies should expand their engagement beyond traditional states to new centers of growth and opportunities. I was very happy to hear from the minister from Orissa who was here that he, in fact, is here precisely with a view to tapping those opportunities. At the level of the government, we must continue to seek new enabling environment to address the requirements of the new economy, and we must begin the third review of SECA and further strengthen trade facilitation and customs cooperation. The themes in this Business and Innovation Summit cover all the exciting areas of opportunities in the traditional sectors and those that will shape our future. From Southeast Asia to East Asia and further to the Pacific and the shores of America, the region hosts most of our major partners and a huge part of trade and investment ties. Most of our free trade agreements are in the region. Over the past decade, these FTAs have brought us closer to the region, but have also increased our trade deficit with our partners. Yet, we are active participants in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or RCEP, negotiations. We share the strategic and economic vision of our ASEAN partners for RCEP. We want to see a comprehensive, fair, balanced agreement that lifts up all nations on the tide of trade and investment. The choices we will make will finally depend on our balance of our economic and strategic interests that we see coming out of the negotiations. In this time of headwinds against globalization, Rising protectionism, a fragmenting world of trade, weakening institutions, and eroding multilateralism, there is an urgent need for all of us to come together to strengthen the multilateral trade regime. My association with GATT and the WTO has been long. I remain firmly of the belief that all of us will benefit the most when the multilateral trade regime remains the bedrock of global trade. As our world races into the digital age and value is increasingly generated on cyber networks, trade dialogue and agreements will also have to address new services, new methods of delivering them, e-commerce and ownership and cross-border flow of data. In conclusion, let me say that in an age of tensions, disputes and uncertainty, Singapore, indeed the world, can find no better land of opportunity and stability than India. For India, there is no better gateway to the world than Singapore. And for us both, there is no better time than to deepen our partnership for our two countries and for a more stable and peaceful future for our region. Thank you very much.